Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This video uses AI narration to present our original book analysis.
Ah, cool.
Today, we're diving deep into Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, the Rise of Disaster Capitalism.
Okay.
This book challenges us to, rethink history, arguing that crises, from natural disasters to economic collapses,
Right.
are often exploited to push through radical free market policies. So think Chile under Pinochet,
Yeah.
post-Soviet Russia, or even New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina.
Okay, I see. So what's so fascinating is how Klein connects these seemingly unrelated events.
Right.
She argues that these moments of upheaval, when people are disoriented, vulnerable, are used to implement policies that would normally face strong opposition.
It's like taking advantage of the chaos to make sweeping changes before anyone can really process what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those changes, she argues, often benefit a select few,
Right.
the wealthy and powerful, at the expense of the majority,
Of course.
leading to increased inequality. She calls this disaster capitalism, where crises become opportunities for profit,
Right.
and advancing a particular economic ideology.
So let's get into the theory behind this.
Yeah.
Klein draws on the work of economist Milton Friedman
Right.
and his idea of shock treatment. Can you explain that for us?
So Friedman believed that the only way to break free from stagnant economic systems was through rapid and drastic change. He argued that moments of crisis provide a unique opportunity to implement radical free market reforms. It's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid,
Yep.
Do it quickly before people can organize and resist.
And this wasn't just an abstract theory. Friedman had a chance to put his ideas into practice, right?
Yes, he did. He became an advisor to General Pinochet in Chile after the 1973 coup.
Right.
Chile was in a state of immense turmoil,
Yeah.
which Friedman saw as the ideal time to implement his shock therapy.
So what did that look like in practice?
Right.
What kind of policies were implemented?
Think tax cuts, privatization, deregulation, and cuts to social spending.
Right.
A complete overhaul of the economy implemented alongside severe political repression.
Right.
Klein argues that this violence was a key part of creating the conditions for radical economic change.
So the shock and the shock doctrine is literal in many cases.
Yes.
It's not just about economic policies. It's about creating a climate of fear and silencing opposition.
Precisely.
Right.
And Klein connects this to the work of psychiatrist Ewan Cameron,
Okay.
who experimented with sensory deprivation and other techniques as part of the CIA's MPultra program.
Wait, a psychiatrist involved in CIA experiments?
Yes.
What does that have to do with economic policy?
Well, it's about understanding how psychological manipulation can be used to break down resistance. Klein argues that some of Cameron's techniques, developed in the context of the Cold War, were later adapted and used in other settings, including Latin American dictatorships, to suppress dissent and enforce compliance.
So there's a connection between the psychological techniques used in torture and the principles of shock therapy. Both are about inflicting pain and disorientation to achieve a specific goal.
Exactly.
It's a chilling thought, and it's not just a relic of the past. Klein argues that these patterns are recurring, pointing to more recent examples like the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
Right.
How so? What happened in New Orleans?
So after Katrina, there was a push for privatization and the dismantling of public services.
Yeah.
Schools, hospitals, even the public housing system were restructured, often in ways that benefited private companies and displaced local communities.
So the disaster became an opportunity to remake the city along free market lines, even if it meant displacing the very people who needed help the most.
That's Klein's argument.
Yeah.
And she sees a similar pattern in other cases, like the Iraq War.
How does the Iraq War fit into this?
So Klein argues that the U.S. invasion of Iraq, particularly the shock and awe doctrine, was a key example of disaster capitalism in action. She points to the rampant corruption, the waste, and the profiteering that occurred during the Reconstruction, arguing that the chaos of war was exploited for profit.
So it wasn't just about liberating Iraq or fighting terrorism. It was about using the war to advance a particular economic agenda.
That's the unsettling part. Klein is suggesting that these events, separated by time and geography, reveal a disturbing pattern, a blueprint for creating shock and exploiting vulnerability.
And this blueprint has been used repeatedly in different parts of the world, often with devastating consequences.
Exactly. And Klein argues that it's not just about governments and powerful individuals.
Right.
She points to the rise of what she calls the disaster capitalism complex.
What is that? What does she mean by disaster capitalism complex?
She's talking about a global network of corporations, think tanks, lobbyists, and media outlets that directly benefit from situations of crisis and instability. They have a vested interest in shaping public perception and influencing government policy.
So it's not just about profiting from disaster. It's about shaping the narrative, creating a climate of fear, and promoting policies that benefit them even if they harm others.
That's what Klein is arguing. And she sees this complex as a growing threat to democracy and social justice. Picking up where we left off, it's important to remember that the shock Klein talks about doesn't always have to be like a dramatic event, like, a war or a natural disaster.
Right. So what else can create this kind of shock that makes people vulnerable to these policies?
Even something like hyperinflation can create a collective shock.
Yeah.
A sense of panic, desperation. People just want stability.
Sure.
And that desperation can be exploited.
That makes sense. If people are worried about their basic needs,
right,
they might be more willing to accept radical changes.
Right.
Even if those changes are ultimately harmful.
Exactly. And Klein gives the example of Bolivia in the 1980s.
Okay.
They were dealing with hyperinflation. And Jeffrey Sachs, an economist who was initially advocating for a more gradual approach to economic reform, ended up pushing for a shock therapy program.
So even someone who started with good intentions could be swayed by the allure of a quick fix.
It's a complex situation, and Sachs himself has been critical of some aspects of shock therapy. But his experience in Bolivia shows how tempting that quick fix can seem, especially when you're dealing with a crisis that feels overwhelming.
But as Klein argues, those quick fixes often have long-term consequences. Didn't she say that shock therapy programs often make inequality worse?
Yes, and she argues that it's not just about economics, it's about reshaping societies in a way that favors a free market ideology, even if it comes at the expense of democracy and social well-being.
It's interesting you mentioned democracy, because one of the things that really stood out to me in the book was Klein's analysis of what happened in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
You'd think that would be a moment for more democracy, not less.
You would think so, but Klein argues that the transition to capitalism in Russia was heavily influenced by shock therapy advocates, who pushed for rapid privatization and deregulation. This created a lot of chaos and instability, which ultimately led to the rise of the oligarchs and a consolidation of power in the hands of a few.
So instead of a transition to a more democratic system, Russia ended up with a system that was just as unequal and authoritarian, but this time the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a new elite.
That's essentially Klein's argument.
Right.
And she doesn't just focus on the big picture. She also brings in personal stories to show how these policies impacted real people's lives.
That's one of the things I appreciate about the book. It wasn't just an abstract economic treatise.
Right.
She really showed the human cost of these policies.
Absolutely. For instance, she has a whole section on the use of torture.
Yeah.
As a tool of social control and economic transformation.
Yeah.
It's a really disturbing part of the book.
Yes. I remember that. It was hard to read about the experiments that you and Cameron conducted as part of the M-Culture program.
Right.
The sensory deprivation, the electroshock therapy, the LSD.
Yeah.
It's terrifying to think that this was happening with government support.
It's a dark chapter in history. And Klein argues that it's not just an isolated incident. She connects it to the broader pattern of using psychological techniques to break down resistance and achieve political and economic goals.
And she connects it to the shock and awe campaign in Iraq.
Exactly. Klein points out the similarities between Cameron's experiments and the use of sensory deprivation and overload in military tactics.
Right.
It raises serious questions about the ethics of using psychological manipulation, whether it's in a clinical setting, a prison, or on a battlefield.
It's like she's saying that the logic of the shock doctrine extends beyond economic policy.
Right.
It's about power and control.
Yes.
And the willingness to use any means necessary to achieve those ends.
That's a key point. And this logic, Klein argues, is often supported by powerful institutions like the IMF and the World Bank.
You mean the institutions that are supposed to be helping countries develop?
Yes, Klein is very critical of the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and World Bank often impose on developing countries.
Right.
She argues that these programs often force countries to adopt austerity measures, privatize state assets, and open up their economies to foreign investment.
Which sounds a lot like the shock therapy policies we've been talking about.
Exactly, and Klein argues that this creates a new form of colonialism, where indebted nations are essentially forced to sacrifice their sovereignty and the well-being of their people to appease global financial institutions and corporations.
So it's not just about economics, it's about power.
Yeah.
And who gets to make decisions that impact people's lives?
That's a core part of Klein's argument. She connects the economic policies of the Shock Doctrine to the political repression that often accompanies them, arguing that the two are inseparable.
Meaning that you can't implement these kinds of radical free market policies without also cracking down on dissent and silencing opposition.
Exactly. Klein shows how violence, whether it's state-sanctioned or carried out by private security forces, is often used to create a climate of fear that makes it easier to push through unpopular policies.
She talked a lot about the rise of private security firms like Blackwater.
Yes, and she's critical of the privatization of war.
Right.
And the blurring of lines between military operations and corporate profiteering.
Right.
These companies operate with little oversight or accountability, and their actions often have devastating consequences for civilians.
It's like we're outsourcing war to the highest bidder with little regard for human rights or international law.
That's a key concern that Klein raises. And it all ties back to the idea of the disaster capitalism complex that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
It's not just about responding to crises, it's about actively shaping the narrative around them and profiting from the resulting chaos.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create the conditions for disaster.
Right.
Then you profit from the response.
That's essentially what Klein is arguing, and she suggests that this is leading to a dangerous erosion of democracy and a concentration of power in the hands of a few who benefit from perpetual crisis.
It's a pretty bleak picture. But you mentioned earlier that Klein also offers some glimmers of hope.
Right.
What does she suggest we can do to counter these trends?
She highlights the importance of social movements, grassroots organizing, and a renewed focus on public services and social safety nets. She sees these as ways to build resilience, resist privatization, and create a more just and equitable world.
So it's not just about critiquing the problem.
Right.
It's about actively working to create a different future.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that we have a choice.
Yeah.
We don't have to accept the shock doctrine as inevitable.
Right.
We can create a world where crises are met with compassion and solidarity, not exploitation.
And one of the most striking examples that Klein uses to illustrate this point is Hurricane Katrina, right?
Yes. Klein argues that Hurricane Katrina wasn't just a natural disaster.
Right.
It was a human-made disaster, exacerbated by failures of infrastructure, inadequate government response, and deep-rooted inequalities.
And she argues that the disaster was then used as an opportunity to implement shock doctrine policies.
Precisely. She describes how the privatization of services, the influx of private contractors, and the dismantling of public housing all contributed to the displacement of communities and a deepening of inequality in New Orleans, especially for Black communities who were already disproportionately impacted by the storm.
So instead of responding to the needs of the people, the disaster was used to further entrench the very systems that had created conditions for such devastation in the first place.
That's Klein's argument, and it's a powerful reminder that disasters don't affect everyone equally, and that the way we respond to crises often reflects and reinforces existing power structures.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation, but I think we're running out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
What should we focus on in the next part?
In the next part, let's look at some of the specific examples Klein uses to illustrate the global reach of the shock doctrine and how its logic has been applied in different contexts.
Okay.
From Latin America to Asia to Eastern Europe.
Sounds good.
Okay.
We'll see you there for the final part of our deep dive into the shock doctrine. So we've been talking about Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine and, how she argues that crises are often exploited to advance a particular economic agenda.
Right.
It's been pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
About how this shock doctrine seems to transcend, traditional political divides.
That's one of the most striking aspects of Klein's argument. She's not just critiquing a particular political party or ideology.
Right.
She's suggesting that there's a deeper logic at work. A system that benefits from instability and uses crises to push through policies that wouldn't be accepted under normal circumstances.
So it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican in power, the underlying agenda remains the same.
That's what Klein seems to be suggesting.
Yeah.
She looks at examples from the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher,
right,
the 1990s under Clinton and Blair,
yeah,
and the 2000s under the Bush administration.
Right.
And she argues that despite their differences, they all embraced this logic of disaster capitalism to varying degrees.
It's almost like an ideology that transcends traditional left-right politics. It's about who really holds the power in our societies.
Right.
Corporations, financial institutions, the wealthy elite.
Yeah.
Versus the interests of everyday people.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Klein argues that this shift in power has been happening for decades.
Right.
And it's been facilitated by the Shock Doctrine.
Right.
Using crises to push through policies that would normally face massive resistance.
And you mentioned earlier how 9/11 was a prime example of this, right?
Yes. Klein argues that the attacks on 9/11 provided the perfect opportunity to implement a whole range of policies that had been on the wish list of free market advocates for years.
Right.
The Patriot Act, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the massive expansion of the surveillance state.
Yeah.
It's like 9/11 created a blank slate. And the disaster capitalism complex was ready to write its own script.
It's hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
Those were sweeping changes that reshaped American society in a profound way.
Right.
And it all happened so quickly under the guise of national security.
And Klein argues that this wasn't just about responding to a real threat.
Right.
It was about using the fear and disorientation created by the attacks to push through a much broader agenda.
Yeah.
An agenda of privatization, deregulation, and the expansion of corporate power, both domestically and internationally.
And she doesn't shy away from the costs of that agenda, right?
Mm-hmm. No, she documents the human rights, abuses the corruption, the waste, the erosion of democratic values that have accompanied the rise of disaster capitalism.
Right.
She argues that these costs have been borne disproportionately by the most vulnerable among us, both in the U.S. and around the world.
One of the most disturbing examples she gives is the privatization of war.
Right.
With companies like Blackwater playing an increasingly prominent role.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
It's a very troubling development.
Yeah.
These private military contractors operate with little oversight or accountability, and their actions often blur the lines between legitimate military operations and corporate profiteering.
Right.
It raises serious questions about who has the right to use force and for what purposes.
It's like we're moving toward a world where war is just another business opportunity, a way for corporations to profit from violence and instability.
That's a disturbing thought, and it's one of the key challenges that Klein's book forces us to confront.
Yeah.
If everything becomes a market, including war and security,
right,
then what happens to our values, our ethics, our sense of shared humanity?
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope? Does Klein offer any solutions?
She doesn't offer a simple solution.
Right.
But she does point towards some possible paths forward.
Yeah.
She highlights the importance of social movements, grassroots organizing, and a renewed focus on public services and social safety nets.
Yeah.
She sees these as ways to build resilience, resist the forces of disaster capitalism, and create a more just and equitable world.
So it's not about giving in to despair or cynicism.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice.
Exactly.
That we can challenge these trends and work towards a different future.
It's about remembering that we don't have to accept the logic of the Shock Doctrine.
Right.
We can choose a different path.
Yeah.
A path that prioritizes human well-being over corporate profits. A path that emphasizes solidarity and cooperation over competition and exploitation.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's one that resonates deeply with a lot of people, especially in times like these, when we're facing so many interconnected crises.
Klein's book is a challenging read,
right,
but it's an important one.
Yeah.
It helps us understand the forces that are shaping our world.
Yeah.
And it encourages us to think critically about the choices we face both individually and collectively.
It's a reminder that even small actions can make a difference.
Right.
Supporting organizations that are fighting for social justice, holding our elected officials accountable, educating ourselves and others about these issues.
Exactly.
It all adds up.
And most importantly, we need to refuse to accept the narratives of fear and inevitability that are often used to justify policies that harm people and the planet.
Yeah.
We need to believe that a different world is possible, and we need to act accordingly.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into the Shock Doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex and challenging book, but it's also a vital one for anyone who wants to understand the forces shaping our world today. If this conversation has sparked your curiosity, we highly encourage you to read the book and explore these ideas further.
And if you're looking for more deep dives like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel and purchase the book via the provided link. Your support helps us continue to explore these critical ideas and make them accessible to a wider audience. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
We'll see you in our next deep dive.